Imagine a love so intense, so obsessive, that it drives someone to commit the unthinkable. A woman shoots her ex-boyfriend 6 times, all because he moved on. What makes someone go that far? Is it love or something darker? Stay tuned to uncover the shocking truth behind this twisted crime. You won't believe how it all unfolds. The sun was setting, casting a deep orange glow across the city. It was quiet. Too quiet. Riley stepped out of his car, his boots scraping the gravel. He didn't know why he felt uneasy. He had parked in front of the old apartment building, his new place. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to your skin. It was supposed to be a fresh start. He had moved on. He was ready. But something felt off. As Riley approached the entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Emily, his ex-girlfriend. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something unsettling. She was holding a bag, her fingers trembling. Riley froze. He hadn't seen her in months. "Emily," he said, his voice hesitant. Her lips curled into a twisted smile. "Did you think you could just move on without consequences?" she hissed. Riley took a step back. Her voice was low, a strange crackling sound in the air. "Look, Emily," he started. "I didn't want to hurt you. You know that." But her eyes, they were burning with a cold, dark fury. She took another step forward. "I know what you did." With her, Emily spat. His stomach sank. He thought back to the new woman in his life, the one he had hoped would fill the emptiness. "Emily," Riley tried again. "It's over. We're over." The words hung heavy between them. He didn't know what else to say. She was shaking now, a tremor that ran through her entire body. Then, without warning, Emily pulled out a gun. Riley's breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, his hands raised. "No." "Emily, don't." But it was too late. The first shot rang out loud and sharp. Riley stumbled, his chest exploding in pain. She wasn't stopping. Shot after shot. The cold metal ripped through him. 6 times. Each bullet tearing into his flesh. The world spun. His legs gave way. The pain was all-consuming. Emily stood over him, her expression unreadable. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly. She didn't say a word. She just stared. And then, slowly, she turned and walked away, leaving Riley broken on the ground. The sound of Emily's footsteps faded into the distance. Riley could feel his heart slowing, each beat echoing louder in his ears. His vision blurred, the edges of his sight darkening. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The weight of his limbs was unbearable. His chest burned, a deep, fiery agony that seemed to spread with every breath. There was a metallic taste in his mouth, sharp and bitter. He tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It was like the world was slipping away from him, piece by piece. His thoughts were tangled, disjointed. Emily's face flashed before him, her twisted smile, the gun in her hands. Was this real? Was he dreaming? No. This was real. He was dying. The distant sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the murmur of voices, everything felt so far away now. The cold pavement beneath him seemed to embrace him, pulling him into the ground. He could hear the faint crackle of a siren in the distance, but it felt too late. His breaths came in shallow gasps. He couldn't move. His body felt numb, like he was fading into another world. A scream bubbled up inside him, but it stayed trapped, lodged in his throat. He wanted to shout for help, to call for someone, anyone to save him. But there was no one. Only Emily's haunting smile burned into his memory. The sirens grew louder. But Riley was already slipping away. He tried to focus on something, anything, to keep him grounded. But his vision was fading, the edges darkening more with every second. His body was shutting down. And then, just before everything went black, he heard it. A voice. It was distant, distorted, but it was there. "Help, help." But Riley couldn't answer. He was already gone. The city remained unaware of what had just unfolded in the shadows of its quiet streets. Emily, the girl he once loved, was already gone. Gone into the night, leaving behind nothing but silence and blood. No one would know the truth for hours. By the time the first responders arrived, Riley's body was cold, the life drained from him. The paramedics rushed to him, but it was clear. Too late. His time had run out. The detectives arrived soon after, their voices low as they surveyed the scene. The bloodstains, the scattered shell casings on the ground. They knew it wasn't a random act. It wasn't just another shooting. This was something personal. The investigators began to piece it together.
Emily.
They found her quickly, just as she had vanished into the city streets. She wasn't hiding. She didn't care. They arrested her without hesitation. As they placed her in the back of the squad car, she was eerily calm. Her eyes, however, were vacant, empty, like she was lost in a world no one else could see. Her fingers drummed lightly on the seat, as if in a trance. When they asked her why, the answer was simple. "I loved him," she whispered, her voice cold. "I loved him too much." The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't sure if they understood her words, or if they ever would. But one thing was clear. Emily had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. In the days that followed, the city would talk. Whispers of betrayal, of obsession, of love turned deadly. And in the darkness of his final moments, Riley's life would be remembered. A tragic story, a haunting ending, and a love that was never meant to be. The trial came swiftly. The courtroom was packed, the tension thick in the air. Emily sat in the defendant's chair, her face as expressionless as ever. The walls seemed to close in around her as the prosecution laid out the horrifying details. The 6 shots.
The blood.
The cold, calculated nature of the crime. Riley had been more than just a victim. He was the target of an obsession that had spiraled out of control. The defense tried to argue. Emily wasn't in her right mind, they claimed. Her emotions had consumed her, clouding her judgment. But the evidence spoke for itself. Her actions, her lack of remorse. There was no excuse. The courtroom was silent when Emily took the stand. Her voice was monotone, devoid of any emotion as she recounted that night. She spoke of her heartbreak, her anger, and how she couldn't bear to see Riley move on. The love she had felt for him had twisted into something darker, something dangerous. "I thought if I couldn't have him," she said, her eyes vacant. No one could. Her words hung in the air, chilling everyone in the room. The families of both Riley and Emily sat on opposite sides of the room, their faces a mix of disbelief, grief, and horror. There was no winner here. The jury deliberated for hours. And when they finally returned, the verdict was clear.
Guilty.
Emily was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led away, her eyes didn't show fear. There was no regret, just a strange calm, as though she had already left the world behind. The news coverage of the case continued for weeks. It became a haunting reminder of how jealousy, obsession, and unhealed wounds could destroy everything. People talked about how love could turn violent, how someone could become so consumed by their feelings that they would sacrifice everything, even their own sanity, to hold on to it. The story of Riley, his tragic end, and Emily's descent into madness would stay with them long after the headlines faded. It was a story of love, but not the kind anyone hoped for, not the kind anyone should ever experience. And as the city moved on, so did the memory of what had happened. But in the dark corners of some people's minds, it lingered. A chilling reminder of the dangers of obsession. Months passed, but the city was never quite the same. People walked the streets with a little more caution, their eyes a little more wary. Riley's death had become a shadow that loomed over them all, a reminder of how something so seemingly innocent, love, could turn into something deadly. Emily's trial was over, and she had vanished into the cold, in different walls of prison. But for those who had known Riley, the pain never truly went away. His friends, his family, they struggled to make sense of what had happened. How could someone who had once been so full of life, so full of promise, be taken so abruptly? The grief never fully left them. It settled deep within, like a weight that no one could shake off. They visited his grave often. They whispered their goodbyes. But it never felt like enough. It wasn't just the loss of Riley that haunted them. It was the cruel, senseless nature of his death. The gunshots, the emptiness in his eyes as he lay there, unable to move, unable to speak. They often wondered if there had been anything they could have done. Could they have seen the signs? Could they have warned him? But in the end, it didn't matter. Riley was gone, and all they had left were memories that would never fade. But Emily's story didn't end there. As time went on, her name continued to surface in news reports, in crime documentaries, in conversations. She became a symbol of the dark side of love, an example of what can happen when obsession overtakes reason. Psychologists and experts debated her case for years. Was it the trauma of a broken heart that led her to commit such a horrific act? Or was there something deeper, something more sinister, at play within her mind? But for the families and friends who had loved Riley, none of it mattered. They would never get the answers they were searching for. What they knew was this: jealousy had killed him, a love that had twisted into madness, a woman consumed by her need to control, to possess. In the end, Riley's life was taken by something no one could have predicted. A relationship that had once seemed full of promise, now reduced to a tragic story of betrayal, heartbreak, and violence. And as the years went on, the haunting reminder of that night would never fade. The city would always carry the weight of Riley's death, and Emily's chilling words would echo in the back of their minds forever. Years passed, but the scars left by that night remained deep within the community. The apartment building where Riley had moved to start fresh stood silent, almost as if it too had felt the tragedy that unfolded beneath its walls. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones when it was mentioned. Some still remembered the sounds, the sirens, the chaos. Others preferred to forget, but the memory of Riley's death lingered like an unshakable ghost. The case continued to resurface in local media. It was too shocking, too dark to ever be forgotten. Documentaries were made, articles published, podcasts dedicated to dissecting the events of that night. People watched, listened, and theorized. But no one could truly understand the pain, the confusion, the sheer horror that had gripped Riley in his final moments. For his family, the passage of time didn't ease the pain. They had to move on with their lives, but part of them was always trapped in that moment. The night they lost him, they could still feel it, the heaviness in the air, the feeling that something was wrong, the questions that never had answers. They sought solace in their memories of Riley, his laughter, his kindness, the way he had always been there for them. But those memories were forever tainted by the tragic way his life had ended. They couldn't escape the thought that it was all because of Emily. She had destroyed their son, their brother, their friend. The woman who once claimed to love him had taken his life in the most violent, unforgivable way. And for that, they could never forgive her. As for Emily, her life in prison was no less chaotic than the storm she had created. She became the subject of intense study, her psychological profile analyzed by countless experts. Was she mentally ill, a victim of her own twisted emotions? Was she a manipulator, someone who saw others as objects to control? Her prison life was quiet, marked by long, solitary hours and the occasional therapy session. She rarely spoke to anyone, keeping to herself in her cell. Sometimes, a guard would catch her staring into the distance, her face unreadable. And then, just as suddenly as she had broken, Emily would return to her calm demeanor, like nothing had ever happened. She was a puzzle, an enigma, the kind of person whose actions defied explanation. But in the end, it didn't matter. Nothing could undo the damage she had caused. Riley's death was final, irreversible. And Emily's life, now locked away in a prison of her own making, would never be the same. The city had moved on. But for those who had loved Riley, the echoes of that night would always be with them. A constant reminder of the destructive power of love when it's twisted by obsession. Years drifted by, but for those who had known Riley, the world felt a little colder. His absence was a void that could never be filled. His friends continued their lives, but they carried the burden of what happened that night with them, like an invisible weight that never quite lifted. Every milestone, every new chapter, whether it was a wedding, a child being born, or a promotion, reminded them of what could have been. They would talk about Riley in passing, as if to keep his memory alive, but it was never the same. It was as if his spirit had been torn away, leaving only the hollow shell of a person they used to know. The city kept moving, as cities do, but Riley's story would never fade completely. It became one of those cautionary tales people told when speaking of the dangers of jealousy, obsession, and unrequited love. People tried to learn from it, but in the end, the lessons were too painful to bear. There was no good that came from this tragedy. Just pain, just loss. And as the years passed, Riley's family quietly lived on, not without love, but with a sense of emptiness that could never be erased. They didn't want revenge anymore. They didn't want Emily's suffering. They just wanted Riley back, even if it was only for a moment, to hear his voice one more time, to see his face light up in the way it always had when he smiled. But they knew that wasn't possible. Life had continued without him, and so they had to, too. They visited his grave regularly, always bringing flowers, always speaking softly, as though Riley might hear. Sometimes they imagined he was still there with them, watching over them. But deep down, they knew he was gone, and nothing would bring him back. The darkness that had enveloped Emily's actions still haunted their memories. The empty look in her eyes during the trial, the coldness in her voice when she spoke about Riley. It was something they could never forget. And yet, as time wore on, they began to feel something else. A sense of resolution, maybe. A realization that they couldn't carry the weight of anger forever. They didn't need to forgive Emily, but they had to let go. Let go of the pain, the anger, the endless cycle of grief. Riley would never be forgotten. But in order to heal, they needed to stop letting his death define their every waking moment. They learned, slowly, to keep his memory alive in quieter, gentler ways. In their hearts, where it would remain forever. The city carried on with its noise and bustle, and Riley's name slowly faded into the past, where it would be remembered in hushed tones, in articles, in documentaries, and in whispered conversations. But to those who truly loved him, Riley's memory was a part of them. And it always would be. The years blurred into one another, the pain softening like a scar that, though still visible, no longer felt quite as raw. For Riley's family and friends, healing had become a slow process, an ongoing journey of learning to live without him, while carrying his memory in ways that were both painful and beautiful. They found comfort in the small things, the moments of joy that Riley had left behind in the lives he had touched. The laughter of his childhood friends. The stories told by his coworkers about how hard he worked, how he always had a kind word for everyone. Even the quiet moments they shared, sitting together, remembering the good in him. But Emily's presence still loomed in the background. No matter how much time passed, her actions remained a dark shadow over their memories. She had destroyed more than just Riley's life. She had shattered the lives of those who had loved him. But the passage of time had done something else as well. It had allowed Riley's family to step away from the anger. They didn't seek vengeance anymore. They didn't need it. Instead, they began to focus on what they could still control, their own healing. Riley would always be with them, in their hearts and in the quiet moments of reflection. As for Emily, her story continued, though less frequently. Occasionally, there would be news of her behavior in prison, reports of her strange calm, of her attempts at therapy, her refusal to engage with others. But the curiosity about her had waned. Her face, once plastered across headlines, had faded from the public's memory, replaced by new stories, new tragedies, new crimes. But for those who had lived through the tragedy, Emily would always be a part of the story, a person who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And in the end, as painful as it was, that was the final truth. Riley had loved deeply, and Emily had loved too, though her love had been corrupted into something dark and dangerous. Love, in all its forms, was fragile. It could build, and it could destroy. And as the years went by, the memory of what happened lingered, but Riley's family had learned something powerful. The most important thing they could do was to honor his memory, not by holding on to the pain, but by remembering the man he was before everything shattered. His kindness, his joy, his passion. That was what they wanted to carry forward. Not the violence, not the heartbreak, but the love he had given freely, without condition. And slowly, as life moved on, they found peace. It wasn't a grand, dramatic peace, but it was a quiet, steady kind of peace, a peace that came from knowing that, in the end, love would always be stronger than obsession. As time wore on, the wounds of the past began to heal, though they would never truly disappear. Riley's family moved through life with a quiet resilience that only those who have endured unimaginable pain could possess. They found themselves, at times, laughing, genuine laughter, the kind Riley would have wanted them to share. The painful memories of that night slowly became part of a larger picture, a life full of light and love that had come before the tragedy. They took solace in the fact that Riley had lived a full, rich life, even if it had been cut short. He had known love.
He had known joy.
And he had left a legacy of kindness and generosity in the hearts of those who knew him best. Emily, meanwhile, remained where she had always been, isolated, her world confined to the walls of the prison. She was a ghost in the system, her case long forgotten by the public. But in her mind, the past still echoed, her thoughts forever locked in the moment when everything had changed. What had driven her to that point? Was it only love? Or was there something deeper that had been lurking beneath the surface all along? She had never fully answered that question, and perhaps she never would. But the world had moved on, as it always did. And for Riley's family, life began to take on new shapes. There were births, weddings, anniversaries, moments of joy that Riley had been part of in spirit. They carried his memory with them in quiet ways, a favorite song, a well-loved book, a place they visited that had always meant something to him. In those moments, they felt his presence, a comfort that came not from mourning, but from celebrating the good he had brought to the world. Though his life had ended in the most tragic of ways, Riley's family understood that he had lived with intention. He had loved, and he had been loved. That, in the end, was all that truly mattered. The story of Riley and Emily had been one of heartbreak, but it was also a story of learning. A story of love's power to heal, but also of its ability to destroy when twisted by obsession and jealousy. And as Riley's family looked toward the future, they found peace in knowing that love, in its purest form, could never be tainted by the darkness of one person's actions. They had come to understand the true meaning of healing, not through forgetting, but through remembering what truly mattered. Riley's life, his kindness, his laughter, his love, these were the things they would hold on to. Not the tragedy, not the violence, just him. Years had passed, but the echoes of that fateful night still lingered. Riley's family, while healing, couldn't help but feel the absence of his presence every time they gathered. They had learned to move forward, to cherish the time they had with him, but his absence was like a shadow that never quite left. They had found solace in the quiet moments, those times when they could remember him as he was, a man full of life, laughter, and love. His favorite songs played softly at family gatherings. His love for the outdoors had inspired trips to the places he'd loved most. His memory lived on in the stories his friends still told, in the small things that carried his spirit. But Emily's story still lingered in the background, a haunting reminder of how love, when poisoned by obsession, could turn into something dangerous. The media had mostly forgotten about her, but Riley's family could never escape the image of her cold eyes, the way she had taken his life without a second thought. The rage they had once felt had mellowed over time, replaced by a quiet, unspoken sorrow for the woman who had caused so much pain. Emily remained locked away in prison, her fate sealed by the actions of that night. What happened to her mind after her conviction was unclear. Did she ever understand the full weight of her actions? Did she ever regret what she had done? The answers didn't matter. In the end, it didn't change anything. Riley was still gone. But the family had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant accepting the loss, finding a way to live with the pain, and holding on to the good memories that would forever keep Riley alive in their hearts. They no longer sought closure, for they had come to realize that some things, some wounds, could never truly close. What mattered now was love. Love in the ways they could still give it to each other, to honor Riley's memory, and to ensure his legacy was one of kindness, not tragedy. Emily's chapter in their lives had ended, but they chose to write the next part of their story with hope, resilience, and the belief that love, in its purest form, would always win in the end. The years continued to unfold, quietly and steadily, like the turning of pages in a book that had long since moved beyond its darkest chapters. Riley's family had found a rhythm, a way to navigate life without him. The pain, though it never fully left, had become a part of them they learned to carry with grace. They had become accustomed to the gaps in their lives, the spaces where Riley should have been, on birthdays, at family gatherings, during moments of celebration. The world kept moving, but every now and then, something would trigger a memory of him, a familiar smell, a phrase someone spoke, a certain song playing on the radio. And in those fleeting moments, Riley was there with them again. Not in the tragic way that his life had ended, but in the joyful way that he had lived. In those quiet moments of reflection, the family realized something important. It wasn't the violence of his death that would define him. It was the love he had given, the kindness he had shown, and the laughter he had shared. The pain of losing him would always exist, but it no longer consumed them. They had learned, over time, to cherish the memories without letting the darkness overshadow the light he had brought into their lives. Emily's name still surfaced from time to time in the media, but it held no power over them anymore. She had been a part of the story, a tragic piece that had caused immense grief. But her chapter was over. The family no longer sought answers from her. They no longer felt the need for retribution. Their healing had nothing to do with her. It was about Riley, about finding peace in his memory, and about moving forward with love in their hearts. And so, the story of Riley, with all its sorrow and beauty, found its place in the past. It was a story of love, of how deep emotions can bind people together, and how fragile life truly is. Riley's family had learned to live with the lessons of that tragedy, not as victims, but as survivors. Their strength, their healing, and their ability to find joy again became the true testament to Riley's life. In the end, they knew this. Love, in all its forms, would always be the legacy they carried forward.